The Loose-fitting Thingamajig, a short story. Our hero has trouble with his neighbour. Once I had one of those loose-fitting thingamajigs, but I lent it to my neighbour Darryl. This Darryl, I hasten to say, for the sake of this account, is a regular chap, and for that matter his wife Pam is too. He works in car insurance. She's a head shrinker. On the whole, they are neighbours of easy respect. They keep a neat lawn. I was, however, expecting the thingamajig to be returned the next day, or perhaps the day after that. But several days went by until, by a chance, I encountered Darryl in his driveway. We exchanged the usuals, noting the state of his lawn, and then, in a heavy pause, I half expected some mention of the borrowed item. There was none. "How's Pam?" I asked. Fine, he said. She had shrunken 6 or so heads that week, he related. But there was no mention of my loose-fitting thingamajig, which seemed to have dropped from his menu. The week before he had been full of it. "Gee, I wish I had one of those thingamajigs," he said. "You know, one of the loose-fitting ones. It's just what I need right now." I knew exactly the ones, for I had one myself. I kept it in the shed, and said with a neighbourly denouement, "You can borrow mine if you like." Now, however, there was no register of it on his face. I might have said to him, after discussing his lawn, "How's my thingamajig? You know the one, the loose-fitting one," with the question implied, "Have you done with it yet?" Yet I had the entirely reasonable and culturally exact expectation that he should raise the topic. He borrowed the goods. There was a code. The borrower raises the topic, not the lendee. The onus is on the borrower to add it to light conversation, short of returning it in good stead. If it is left to the lendee, then, not far after that, we have entered the world of standover merchants and repo men. I met him again at the letterbox several days later, and I figured generously he had simply forgotten. There was a hole in my shed where my thingamajig had been. But on this second occasion, he again refrained. No mention of it. Not a suggestion. A fortnight went by. I arrived home from work one day, and there was Pam. "Hi, Pam," I said. "How goes the head shrinking?" "Pretty good," she said, and related how she had spent the whole afternoon shrinking the head of an airline pilot who was, as she put it, having a nervy. "How's Darryl?" I asked then. She said he was fine, carbuncles notwithstanding. She had actually diagnosed him as bipolar and surreptitiously had him on light medication, shrinking his head very slowly. Look," I then ventured with appropriate hesitation. "I hate to bring this up, but a while ago I loaned Darryl my thingamajig, the loose-fitting one, and well, I need it at the moment. Could you ask him to drop it over?" "Sure," she said, smiling. And that was that. I considered it done. Another 3 days went by. It was at this point that an elementary awkwardness descended. Had Darryl purloined my generous offer? Was it hanging in his shed as if he owned it? Or had he indeed forgotten? Was this a symptom of his disorder or of his medication? There were other possibilities. He might have lent it to Pam's brother Gaylord, who was as mad as a sausage, even though it was not Darryl's to borrow on. I mentioned it to my wife Leanne. "Just ask him for it back," she said. It was a typical thing for a wife to say. She didn't understand the code. After being unhelpful in this way, she said she would speak to Pam. "I've mentioned it to Pam already," I said. "Did she mention it to Darryl?" She said she would. Then, a few days later, just as I was once more arriving home in the tender afternoonness of the day, I saw Darryl at his letterbox again. Quickly I averted my swing and drove directly past, looping around a few streets, killing 10 minutes, and getting home after Darryl had safely gone inside. Then one day I spotted him in the supermarket. I managed to avoid him by recycling down the detergent aisle several times. One day, Leanne and I were heading out for a soiree. As we stepped out the front door, there was Darryl perambulating, carbuncles notwithstanding, on the street front. I turned abruptly and pushed Leanne back in the door. "Jesus, Leanne, it's Darryl." I hushed and quickly shut the door asunder. "So?" said Leanne. She looked at me. "Just ask him for it back," she insisted. I had to tell her the hard truth. "Leanne, you just don't understand the code." In this manner, several months went by, and I successfully avoided Darryl in sundry settings. I stopped going to lawn bowls, one of his haunts. I saw him at the theatre and hid behind my laptop. I avoided him at the garage one sunny afternoon and completely skipped his attention at the coffee shop one frosty morning. I almost ran into him on the corner of Maybury and High Street near the bank, literally. But bumping his shoulder, I pretended he was a random and kept walking, and he kept walking too. It did, of course, become a point of sore extrusions. "What the hell is wrong with this guy?" I said to Leanne one night, visibly frazzled about the entire affair. I marched to the window and looked over at his house with hostile eyes. "It's the last time I ever do him a favour, I'll tell you, Leanne," I vowed. Misunderstanding completely once again, Leanne persisted with her "why don't you just ask him for it back" mode of being insulting. I was riled. "You'd see me humiliated and emasculated over a loose-fitting thingamajig, wouldn't you?" I complained. I didn't get away with talking like that for long. Eventually I agreed upon a scheme. With Leanne's cool measure behind me, I would one day walk over to Darryl's, knock on the door, and when he came to the door I would be cordial and jolly. But quickly I would, with a smile, say, "By the way, Darryl, could I get that thingamajig back? You know, the loose-fitting one." And Darryl would say, "Oh sure, I forgot all about it." And he would fetch it from his shed with no further dalliance. And then he would say, as he handed it back to me, "Gee, I'm sorry you've had to come and ask for it back," thus indicating that the code had been violated, and he was appalled at this outcome. Contrite, he would offer to buy me a beer on Thursday night, hoping to make amends. "That's right," said Leanne. "He's forgotten all about it. Go in there, knock on the door and ask him for it back. He'll probably apologise and offer to buy you a beer." "You're probably right, Leanne," I conceded. But as I headed up Darryl's driveway with the intention of knocking on his door, the sheer injustice of the moment gripped me. I marched back home. "Fuck him, Leanne," I exculpulated, lapsing into French. "Where's my thingamajig?" "Why don't you just buy another one?" she asked. I glared at her, enraged by the betrayal of her even saying such a thing. Another volley of short months went by. I hit upon my own plan. In the deep ink of a moonless night, I was thinking, I could leap over the side fence, sneak past the carport, and alight in Darryl's shed surreptitiously, assuming that is where he kept it. I could then reacquire the item under the emergency clauses of the code, since it's not his thingamajig in the first place. This plan was starting to take shape when, one long eventide, I did encounter Pam once more and couldn't avoid the contact. I was agitated. I knew Darryl could venture out to water the lawn any minute. I knew his movements. I had made a study of his disposition. "Hi, Pam," I said, nevertheless. "How goes the head shrinking?" She related that, just that afternoon, she'd shrunk the head of an orthodontist with suicidal ideation. This seemed to me like a good segue into saying, "I hate to bring this up, Pam, but..." and was going to reiterate the whole situation. But at that moment I thought I detected Darryl in his doorway. "Oh, never mind," I added rapidly. "I've got to go," and scurried homeward in a flash lest Darryl should see me and want to engage in lawn talk. Eventually a year went by. Still no sign of my loose-fitting thingamajig. It had become a fetid puddle. I had become adept in all of Darryl's movements and regular behaviours. He was not a complicated man, and so was able to completely avoid any contact whatsoever. Leanne continued to be unhelpful. "You can't avoid him forever," she said. "It's ridiculous." I insisted I would avoid him until the day he knocked on my door and gave me my thingamajig back, or explained to me that he had lent it to Gaylord and its whereabouts are now unknown, or whatever other excuse he could muster for an entire year's inconvenience. "We could move," I said. Leanne looked gobsmacked. "Move? We could move somewhere closer to your mother," I said, as an enticement. "Are you mad?" she wanted to know. Later I told her I'd seen a lawyer. "A lawyer?" "The recovery of lawful goods," I explained. "What lawyer?" she asked. I confessed that it was in fact my cousin Cameron. I'd seen him at the football. It was not a paying consultation. "He's not a lawyer," Leanne objected. "He did some course in probate and inheritance. He's an undertaker." I confessed that Cameron was by profession in the mortuary business, yes, but he was not clueless about relevant aspects of tort. "I think Pam should shrink your head," she said. As I say, where the onus is on the lendee, there are often uncivil consequences. I did consider a standover merchant and a repo man at one stage. I even spoke to my friend Rodney. He was a man of shady angles. "Do you want me to rough him up?" he said. "No," I explained. "I just want my thingamajig back. It's one of those loose-fitting ones. You know the ones." And I explained that, in fact, on most other accounts, Darryl was a regular chap, and so for that matter was his wife Pam. They were neighbours of easy respect. "What do they do?" asked Rodney. "Well, he's in car insurance and she's a head shrinker." He was contemptuous. "They never give back their thingamajigs, those sort of people," he said, as a man of wide experience. "I can't guarantee I won't rough him up," he said. "I hate guys like that." At length, however, it didn't come to such dire solutions. I managed to never see or converse with Darryl, and hardly ever with Pam, in that entire time. To my chagrin, Leanne and Pam stayed in communique. "Why are you talking to Pam?" I asked Leanne. "She lives next door," she explained. "I'm worried that she'll shrink your head," I said. "You know that she's shrinking Darryl's head, very slowly. You told me that." I then suggested that, since she insisted on fraternising with the neighbours, which I suggested furthermore is uncouth in itself, she could mention my loose-fitting thingamajig and ask it to be returned forthwith, no further questions asked. The hole in my shed was aching. "No," she said. "What do you mean, no?" "No. You go in there yourself and ask him for it back." My exasperation. There were times in those years where, as a married man, I felt unsupported. Another year went by. Then, one afternoon of sullen limelight, the sort of day that makes a good lawn seem in need of nitro, I was standing at the window telling Leanne just how you just can't get that sort of loose-fitting thingamajig anymore. All the new ones are from China and tight and have unmanly safety switches. She was having one of her days. She was saying that if I mentioned Darryl once more, or that thingamajig, then, God help me, she was saying, she would throw a heavy object in my direction. I had a tidy reply to this threat prepared, but at that moment an ambulance pulled up out front of Darryl and Pam's, and in a fuzzy hurry Pam came rushing out to greet the medicos. "There's an ambulance next door," I reported to Leanne. We went out and looked at the emergency. So too did Dick and Heather from across the road. It transpired that Darryl had taken a turn. Leanne talked to Pam and then came back to where I was standing. "Is it an infarction?" I wondered. "It's an infarction," Leanne reported grimly. Apparently the carbuncles had spread to his aorta when no one was looking. "Well, that's no good," I said. "An infarction. The ambulance took him off into a doubtful prognosis. Amidst the front yard hubbub, as the medicoids wheeled him out and loaded him on board and were thumping on his chest, I did venture the bitter undercurrent of my thinking to Leanne. "Calm as a bitch," I suggested quietly. My wife looked at me, then at Darryl having a tube fed down his throat, and said, "You really are horrible, aren't you?" "There are consequences for not returning a man's thingamajig in a timely manner, Leanne," I said. "Darryl didn't have an infarction because he didn't give you your thingamajig back," she said. She understood as little about karma as she did the code. It suddenly occurred to me that, given the hubbub, and with all the attention on the unfolding medical drama, given the sullen limelight of the afternoon, it would cause no harm to anyone if I casually retired backwards to Darryl's shed in order to look around and take what was rightfully mine. I said to Leanne, "I'm just going to nip out the back for a minute," and motioned with my head. She understood my gist. She gritted her teeth. "Don't you dare," she said. "What?" "Don't you dare." Puritans, I thought. As soon as medicoids in pale blue scrubs arrive, everybody's polite and law-abiding. Makes no sense. The thing about infarctions, though, is that they are invariably a turn for the worst, and Pam was understandably upset. Darryl was in hospital, critical, and thus Leanne was cordial and comforting. Pam sat in our lounge room, grey-faced with concern. The doctors had told her it was a big one. "Can they bypass the bypass?" asked Leanne of the surgeons, getting technical. Pam regularly shrunk the heads of heart surgeons. It was a nervous occupation. I stepped forward during a solemn lull. "This might be a bad time to bring it up," I began. Leanne threw a heavy object in my direction. She then took me aside to the kitchen. Karma, however, is a bitch, and Darryl died that Tuesday. As I stressed at the outset, he was a regular chap by most estimations, and by God he kept a tidy lawn. True, I hadn't seen him or spoken to him for years, but I remembered him fondly for all of that. I went to the funeral. Easy respect. I sidled up next to Pam's brother Gaylord. You could see the sausage of madness in his eyes. Why, I was wondering, do head shrinkers invariably have brothers who are unhinged around all their edges? "I don't suppose," I said, "that Darryl lent you one of those loose-fitting thingamajigs, did he, Gaylord?" "What's a loose-fitting thingamajig?" he asked. They were just lowering Darryl into his grave. "You know," I said, "one of those loose-fitting ones." "Is this a sexual allusion?" asked Gaylord. At the reception afterwards, I tried to engage with Darryl's altogether sane brother, Phil. I did wonder about the provisions of Darryl's will, and specifically whether the contents of his shed now became the sole property of Pam, or what. Leanne overheard my line of inquiry. She maintained her begrieved smile among the gathered mourners, but came close and said to me, from the side of her mouth, quite quietly, "If you mention your thingamajig here once, even once, I will cut off your balls. Understand?" It was not a sexual allusion, but Leanne was going to treat it as one. It's the typical thing a wife says to her husband at funeral receptions. "There are legal questions, Leanne," I observed. "No, there aren't," she objected. "Just ask Pam for it back." Then she said to herself, "My God, this has been going on for years." I looked around. Funerals are matters of delicate avoidances. It seemed to me that most people there were hoping not to run into someone or other. I no longer had the problem. Darryl was gone, but things were still not right in the world. "After this," I said to Leanne, "I'm going to see Cameron. This is his field."